Welcome to the Rundown Report. As a rundown mom, I have many questions about things. I rarely get to find answers. Here is where I try to understand the world. Today's episode is for subscribers, with a brief preview at the start. Hey everybody, I just wanted to record a quick podcast to go over my new article, How Minnesotans Talk About Fraud, Don't Say Somalia. On my Substack page, Lightening Up, if you're not subscribed, you should go over there and subscribe right now. So, since the City Journal article by Chris Rufo came out, other articles have come out from the New York Times, from the Washington Post. There have been plenty of interviews with Tim Walz and others. So I'm going to quickly go through a lot of these articles and quotes so that you can get a rundown of some of the fraud that I covered in my previous podcast. So in regard to the City Journal article by Ryan Thorpe and Chris Rufo, they talk about the Housing Stabilization Service program fraud. In 2021, the program paid out more than, quote, $21 million in claims. In the following years, annual costs shot up to $42 million, then $74 million, then $104 million. During this first 6 months of 2025, payouts totaled $61 million. End quote. That's just going over fraud in one case. They go on to say, unlike most Medicaid fraud, Joe Thompson, the former Minnesota U.S. attorney, said that they weren't doing overbilling, which is the usual way that Medicaid and Medicare fraud occurs. Quote, these are often just purely fictitious companies solely created to defraud the system. So he's saying that they are, quote, operated out of dilapidated storefronts or rundown office buildings, end quote. Further on in the Thorpe and Rufo report, David Gaither, who is a Minnesota state senator, said, it's a significant disadvantage for you to alienate the Somali community. If you don't win the Somali community, you can't win Minneapolis. And if you don't win Minneapolis, you can't win the state, end quote. Then Thorpe Rufo called out DFL politicians, and they said of Ilhan Omar, quote, Omar's deputy district director, Ali Assi, advocated on behalf of Feeding Our Future, end quote. Omar Fatah, who ran for the Minneapolis mayor, they said this about him, that he, quote, lobbied Governor Tim Walz in support of Feeding Our Future. They went on to talk about autism, Medicaid claims related to treatment centers for Somalia. They went from $3 million in 2018 to $399 million in 2023, with the numbers of centers going from 41 to 328 Somalis. And as for and I talk about this in my previous podcast, they talk about the connections to Al-Shabaab. They sent untold millions through a network of hawalas, informal clan-based money traders, end quote. Now, as for the New York Times article, How Fraud Swamped Minnesota's Social Services System on Tim Walz's Watch by Ernesto Londoño, a few quotes from there. Quote, more than $1 billion in taxpayers' money has been stolen in 3 plots they are investigating. That is more than Minnesota spends annually to run its Department of Corrections. So that's a little bit much. And here's the famous quote that a lot of people said, quote, it was like someone was stealing money from the cookie jar and they kept refilling it, end quote. Lastly, a just really well-written article in the County Highway newspaper or newsletter, and I highly recommend that you subscribe to it and support them because there's some really good writers there. They wrote and are freely sharing online an article that's called The Shame of Our Cities, How Minneapolis-St. Paul Became the Medicaid Fraud Capital of the USA. And that's by Armin Rosen. So here's beautiful writing from that piece. I love this. He talks about the fraud as, quote, the rotten fruit of a partnership between some of the state's leading politicians and sectarian interests that understand government not as a society-shared instrument to address its problems, but as a storehouse to pillage. This article also gives a brief rundown of the history of Somalia. I love this quote that they provide about Minnesota. Quote, its self-congratulatory sense of generosity and its lack of any serious demands on the people it thinks it's helping, embraced a community with the mentality, internal coherence, and organization needed to fully exploit its hosts, end quote. Oh, I highly recommend going and reading this article. Those are all things that have been looked at since up until this fall. Now we have a few additional things added on. Dr. Oz, you know him, he's a famous guy. He put out a statement and he said, "Our message to Walt is clear. Either fix this in 60 days or start looking under your couch for spare change because we are done footing the bill for your incompetence." End quote. Yikes. 60 days, that doesn't seem like a lot of time. Meanwhile, Kelly Loeffler, the head of the Small Business Administration, spent, I think, one day looking into Minnesota Somali-related PPP, Payment Protection Program funds, remember that, during COVID, and found in one day $1 million in fraud just for the businesses that are already implicated in other fraud scandals. Okay, is there anything else? Oh yeah, there's one other thing. There's probably fraud in the SNAP program in Minnesota, with SNAP payouts going from $725 million to $1.9 billion in 1 year span, so from 2020 to 2021. And that's according to Channel 9 Fox News, so you can take that source as it is, but that's probably coming through the national or the federal programs that are already investigating Minnesota. So that is a allegedly brief rundown of some of these important facts and articles surrounding Minnesota fraud. The reason for writing my article is that I saw many within Minnesota state governance, particularly the DFL party, which is the Democrat Farm Labor Party, make the rounds on media to talk about how the Somalis are being targeted, especially by, of course, President Trump, who put out a whole bunch of truth socials and is inviting more federal scrutiny and ICE raids in Minnesota. Still, I don't think that it's fair to blame an entire population of people for, as we like to say, a few bad apples. On the other hand, the same sort of tactics to call out racism and xenophobia and dismiss questions about the Somali community, these are the same tactics that were used to keep people within Minnesota State from investigating the fraud. So that is a real problem. The people who have done a lot of the legwork on this faced tons of pressure while they were exploring the fraud and looking at problems within the Somali community. A lot of these were journalists who were center or even left of center, like me, and found this information out and were horrified. And horrified mostly by the attempts to shut down the conversation in order to try to avoid appearing racist and try to keep this under wraps. Something about it stinks to high heaven. I think it really implicates the DFL because of this desire to squash the story. That concludes your free preview. The rest is available for paying subscribers. If you would like to listen to the rest, please subscribe to the Rundown Report or subscribe on my Lightning Up page at substack.com/@Minnesota Nice Ice Baby. Thanks for your support.